Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I am really excited to be here today with David Ervin, editor of Military Experience and the Arts. How are you, David?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well. We were just commiserating about the cold weather in both of our respective locations. David is in Virginia, where I guess it's chillier than usual.
Quite, yes.
Yeah. All right, so let's jump right in. Are you the founder as well as the editor of the magazine?
I am not the founder. The
Okay.
founder, that honor belongs to Dr. Travis Martin at
Okay.
Eastern Kentucky University. He started the organization. Well, it started as a freshman orientation class full of veterans that became a writing workshop, that became a publication, that became a nonprofit organization that had several different publications. And now it's a nonprofit, and we really just focus on our single publication now, which is As You Were, the Military Review.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I was looking at the site and I saw a lot of different publications. There's Blue Nostalgia, and some others. And then, so As You Were is the current focus of the organization.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. And so when did you come on as editor and how did that happen?
2015. So I wrote a memoir and started writing shorter stuff and submitting it around. And I got a chance to work with a writing workshop with Military Experience in the Arts, and I loved it. And I learned far more about writing than I knew even when I wrote that book. So I continued on with them. I volunteered as like a reader and stuff. And eventually they asked me if I wanted to run the whole show, and I said yes. So
that's great. So the organization does a lot. You teach writing workshops and you produce the journal. And there's sort of like a lot of community outreach, it sounds like, to veterans who want to be writing.
So the publication's really the vehicle with which we reach a pretty broad spectrum of military folks and military adjacent folks, right? So what we do is we have submissions periods, and when a writer or a poet submits to us, they can opt to work with an editor. And sometimes we'll get rough drafts with people that don't know anything at all about writing and want to learn, and we'll team those folks up. They'll work with an editor for several months, really learning the ins and outs of the craft. And in that way, we reach people that might not have had the traditional background of a writer. They just have some life experience that they want to learn to convey to the broader public, or they have an interest in pursuing that as a creative pursuit or even a career choice. There's several books on the bookshelf of folks that came to us. They had 10 years of infantry experience and they read a lot.
Yeah.
And they had some pretty cool ideas for stories, and we had them read a bunch, and we worked with them numerous drafts, and they took off with it. So
that's great. So how does that work? So is that for every single submission you either accept it or you give them a chance to work with an editor? And that seems like a lot of work. Do you have a lot of editors on hand to work with the writers? And also, do you reject writers? Or reject the submissions, I should say, not the writers.
This has been a thing that's evolved over the years, and we've kind of got it figured out now. Because at first there was not a whole. At first there wasn't a whole ton of interest, right? As we became more established, we started getting flooded with submissions. So one submission period, I remember having like 100 submissions, and the idea was we're going to try to work with all of them. Wow. It was all of a sudden very overwhelming, so we kind of had to adjust how we do things. So the first kind of, I guess you'd call it a break on the accelerating process, was give writers an option. Would you like to work with an editor, or would you like to be considered like a traditional up or down vote on publication or rejection? And even that really didn't take it down to a manageable level. So we decided we were going to do a model wherein we gather up to editors for that submission period, and we determine how many folks they can work with. And then we kind of set a number so that we take on the amount of submissions commensurate with the amount of editorial capacity we have for a given volume.
Okay.
And it's still usually pretty high, but no, unfortunately we cannot help everyone. There's
Right.
there's
so
a lot there's
does every piece then get accepted after the writer works with an editor, or is it more we're just trying to help you get your work the best it can be, and you can resubmit it to us, or you can then send it elsewhere?
So usually if a writer does the work, 9 times out of 10, yes, it will get accepted. A lot of times though, we have writers, for instance, that have never worked with an editor before, or we have writers that figure out that this is far more work that I'm actually interested in doing. It's more of a time investment. It's more involved, for whatever reason. There's a lot of I wouldn't say there's a lot of attrition in that regard, but there's certainly some. But we'll keep working with them until we get a piece that we feel is good for publication.
Interesting. Okay, so is there a commonality in the ways that you think pieces need improvement? Like, do you find that writers, I imagine the submissions you're seeing would cover a lot of harrowing ground and different things that are difficult to talk about. So do you think writers tend to shy away from the difficulty, or they express emotion? People, like, is there a common thread among the submissions of suggestions that you guys make, or is it just like totally all over?
It depends on which submission period it is. We've tried to kind of gauge, have like this scientific approach, and it's every submission period we get surprised. Normally writers are very forthcoming about the more harrowing stuff. Nonfiction, for instance, we have had some rather harrowing stories, and working with an empathetic editor that understands this is someone's personal story, and it's also a crafted piece of short literature, right? Having that conversation and imparting that lesson on someone that might not have approached this as a craft, might have just wanted to get their narrative out there. No, they typically don't shy away. We've had some certainly that have finished a piece and had second thoughts, like, I'm not really sure if I want this out there, and that's perfectly all right. That's us fulfilling our mission and helping them learn the craft and such. And then, sometimes we have really fascinating stories, don't have anything to do with trauma whatsoever. They're just some of them are hilarious, some of them are sort of sad in a pedestrian way, I guess you could say. And some of them are just interesting. There's a really wide variety of experiences within the military and with folks with family members in the military.
Sure.
For instance, in the upcoming volume, we've got a poem written by a lady who was her parents were in the military, and she moved all over the country. She wrote this beautiful poem about finding some kind of roots in a very different way than most people do. And so topics like that are very, very powerful in their own right. They're not, wouldn't necessarily call it trauma though, but wide range of stuff that we see.
Yeah. So does the magazine, do you consider the magazine as having a certain kind of slant, like anti-war or pro-war, or is it just, do you consider yourself just like kind of curating all ranges of experience and just kind of wanting to honestly present the military experience?
So one of the things that we pride ourselves on is not having any kind of slant whatsoever.
Right.
We get such a there's such a diverse population that's connected to the military. There's
Hmm.
such diverse points of view that look back on that experience. And I can't say we've had a ton of pro-war pieces. Um, Matter of fact, I can't recall like a single one. There's no, no, I can't. There is definitely a lot of elements of pride in service, stuff like
Yeah.
that. And there's also one of the publications we ran for a while, Blue Nostalgia, the Journal of Post-Traumatic Growth. That was taking these trauma stories and looking at the ways in which it might have ended up. Bettering someone's life wouldn't be the right way to put it, but how did this build your character
Hmm.
moving forward? What perspective on life did this give you that you're grateful for? That kind of stuff. So it's not like a discounting of the the bad parts, but putting those bad parts in context, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I imagine you see a lot of inside stuff that most people do not see. Like we're just reading the newspaper articles, we're seeing the news, we're not getting like the detailed information that you have access to, that your submitters are sort of sharing
Sure.
with you. I'm wondering, like, do you tend to see submissions in a period of time that are focused on a particular region or a particular issue, or again, is it just so wide ranging?
It's pretty wide ranging. With the US pullout out of Afghanistan, we had a couple more pieces related to that. Um, but for the most part, there's a very broad range of stuff we get. We serve veterans and family members from all eras. So we'll always have some work about Vietnam. We'll always have some work about Iraq and Afghanistan, and a lot of Cold War stuff as well. But typically the creative nonfiction, for instance,
Yeah.
um, that doesn't necessarily lend itself well to really topical stuff
Right.
because the way those pieces are presented is takes far more perspective, introspection to kind of to get a really polished piece out of some event that someone's experienced.
Hmm.
So no, certainly there's no correlation between the news cycle
Yeah.
and the types of submissions that we see.
Yeah. Are you ever shocked still? Like you read something and you're just like, wow, I had no idea. Like as a sort of layperson who really, I personally don't know many people who've served in the military. That's sort of just
Mhm.
beyond my world. And sometimes I hear something and I'm like, oh my God, I, I had no idea that that happens in the military or in a war. So, I mean, do you ever encounter like a firsthand, because you have so much experience already, like personal experience and
Sure.
also reading submissions. So, but are there still things that you come across that you're like, wow, I had no idea that this goes on, or that either like this level of emotion is so intense that it's shocking, or this kind of the specific experience is just shocking?
Every time I open the inbox, yes,
Oh, wow.
absolutely. Um, just a couple of examples off the top of my head. We had a gentleman write about working in homeless shelters
Hmm.
and working among homeless veterans, which was a just a really wild piece to look into that to look into that side of the world that
Yeah.
you just don't see very often. And there's a lot of, in the news cycle, there's a lot of discussion about homeless veterans, but
Mhm.
you don't really see what that looks like on the
Right.
ground.
Right.
You don't get to the way he wrote the dialogue and the characterizations of these people, it made them very human, and it made it not at all out of left field. Like, these are people
Yeah.
that they had a couple of life events that put them here.
Right.
And his perspective was that was to see. We've had stuff. Let's see, um, fellow was in the Navy when the Vietnamese refugee crisis was happening,
Mm.
pulling people out of the water, and how he's dealt with that
Yeah.
over the years. Um, gosh, VA psychologists writing poems about
Yeah.
treating guys in the Gulf War, and the photographs that they would bring in and what they thought about that, and
Mm.
how long they lasted in that particular job, because it was just devastating for the soul. Yeah, I'm consistently surprised.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
How do you deal with it on an emotional level? Like, I was talking to Matt of Consequence Forum, and he was just saying,
Hmm.
like, he needs to get up and take a break every once in a while because the submissions, you just cannot read them over a sustained period of time because they're so emotionally intense. And I imagine at, a more mainstream literary journal, obviously there are a lot of intense submissions as well, but I would think for a war theme,
Oh, sure.
like the stuff you're seeing is just going to be really gutting. So, do you sort of become jaded after a while, or is it just like, you read 3 submissions and that's it for the day because it's so intense?
Oh, wow. So, sometimes I don't deal with it very well, honestly.
Yeah.
Um, Over the years, I've kind of learned what works for me and what doesn't, as far as taking care of yourself,
Hmm.
knowing that you're working with material that absolutely rinse your
Yeah.
soul right out of your body,
Yeah.
and especially having been an infantryman in the Iraq War. When I read an Iraq piece, it's like, okay, well,
Yeah.
maybe you should take a walk, or
Yeah.
don't skip yoga tonight,
Right.
or call a friend, and
Yeah.
it's also a matter of perspective. Um, Sometimes reading this stuff, as much as it hurts, I'm really glad that other people are writing about this stuff.
Mhm.
Part of the reason I came to want to write and ended up editing was, when you get back from war, even before you go, you read all these memoirs and these works of fiction, and you realize that people have had the exact same experiences that you have,
Yeah.
that you've had, or you're going to have. Um, Something like James Jones' Thin Red Line had so many universal truths that were very easily understood by me after I'd served.
Mhm.
So it's also a matter of, this is doing good work for the public, for our society,
Yeah.
and for the people writing that stuff. It's very much, healing is a word that gets thrown around a lot,
Right.
but it gives that stuff much deeper meaning,
Mhm.
and in that way it's sort of sustaining, as much as it hurts sometimes.
Yeah. This is a broader question that's sort of taking us away from the lit mag itself, but I'm just wondering, like, your take on veterans these days. Like, do you feel like is there a sense that veterans are getting enough support? That's a hugely broad question. I'm sure we could talk about it goes into policy and all these other things, but it seems like you really would have your finger on the pulse of like how vets are these days. And so are you getting a sense that there's just not support for them out there, or is there greater support than there used to be? I know like PTSD is something that people talk about now that they never used to, like in the 40s, I think people weren't talking about that. So maybe there's more understanding. I don't know. Like, what is your sense?
That's always a tough question. I've been asked it a few times actually.
Hmm.
I think in historical context, there is certainly a far greater level of support than, say, the Vietnam generation had. There are really vast differences between something as giant as World War II was to something as very small scale and insular as Iraq and Afghanistan were. And I think policy-wise, they are doing pretty well and making strides to do better. There's pretty broad-based political support for that. We'll see how long that continues as the most recent wars kind of fade from memory. But I think the broader picture now is that a lot of Vietnam veterans got involved in veteran advocacy after having the experiences that they did. And they really set the stage for my generation of veterans to have a much easier time of it. And that is absolutely a major component of why we have the support that we do. That being said, military service is also something that is not as widespread as it was at different times in our history. And so you have a situation where it can be on the back burner as a political problem. It can be on the back burner as a social problem because fewer and fewer people are being exposed to what military service says. And they might not have relatives that served in Iraq or Afghanistan, whereas everyone has a grandfather that was either in the Korean War or World War II, or drafted at some point during the Cold War, just because military service was so much more universal in those times. You had a military like 16 million people in World War II. So now it's 1.5 million, couple million. And so it's a much smaller segment of our population that does serve. But yeah, it's a complex ongoing thing that'll be interesting to keep an eye on, certainly.
Yeah. And do you see submissions from writers all over the world, or are you primarily focused on American writers?
We certainly see stuff from all over the world. We worked with folks, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, United Kingdom. We had a gentleman, he's got some artwork in the upcoming volume. He was born in Ukraine, educated in Moscow, now US citizen. Certainly see a lot of work from Israel, interestingly. But pretty much the entire English speaking world. We've had folks that had writing from India as well. So it's all over the world. That's among the more interesting parts of editing something in the digital sphere, is you get to be exposed to all these different viewpoints, and you can also see that some things are the same across the pond,
Do you ever think about having an issue where they're sort of like opposing military sides in conversation with each other, like where you would have a US vet and an Iraqi vet, like both with poems?
So
maybe that's a loaded question.
No, I've had conversations with a lot of my colleagues who are like,
Yeah,
we would absolutely love to see the writing of, say, someone that served in the not really officially served, but someone who was part of the insurgency in Iraq,
right.
or a North Vietnamese soldier, or
Mhm.
a Viet Cong irregular, something like that.
Mhm.
We would absolutely love to see that. We would love to expose audiences to those views. The closest we've had is a very gifted fiction writer whose parents, I believe, are from North Vietnam. I want to say his father served in the North Vietnamese army. He wrote some really powerful fiction about service in the North Vietnamese army, and it was, I
Mhm.
mean, it was good stuff.
Yeah,
As far as an issue, having those diametric opposites, it'd probably be pretty hard to pull off, but
yeah.
I'd certainly be up for it. But we try to be as inclusive as possible in every issue.
Mhm.
So it could happen.
Yeah, yeah.
Depends on what comes through the inbox.
And
Always.
so, yeah, so that actually brings me to my next question, which is how do you do the outreach? Like, how are you finding these communities? Do you go to veterans club? Like, yeah, what is your strategy for like reaching both readers for the magazine and also potential contributors?
So as far as potential contributors go, Submittable has been instrumental
Mm.
in finding folks. Their search features and their own, um, they have this, I can't remember the exact phrase they use for it, but it's a newsletter, like a roundup or something like that, that'll send out an email a couple days before submissions close in a
Mhm.
given period. And it pegs everybody that had marked interest in something like war fiction or military or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Um, and we also have there's a lot of word of mouth. The writing community, so the veteran population is fairly small. The
Mhm.
writing community within the veteran population is even smaller. Um, there's also a matter of, as big as the literary industry is with small presses, which I'm sure I'm speaking to the expert here, but as far as publications that are really targeted towards military themed writing, it's fairly small. There's a
Mhm.
handful of it.
Yeah.
So we normally don't have to do too much outreach in order to get writers. Um, sometimes we'll spot emerging writers in other military themed publications and shoot them an email and, hey,
Mhm.
you have any material, because this is good stuff. This is the kind of stuff we want to promote and to curate, and the type of people whose careers we want to advance in any way we can. um and as far as readership goes, every time I shoot an email before the release date, I'll tell writers, hey, we're writers, we work in what outside appearances would see as a vacuum,
Mhm.
but self promotion is absolutely part of it. And the more people share their own work, the more everybody's work gets seen.
Yeah.
So but we have like a subscription list on our website people can sign up for. We have a really broad reach social media. I think our Facebook page has something like 90,000 follows, and far less on Twitter. But
Mhm.
each time we do a publication, we'll feature each story or poem or art piece individually throughout the month or two that it takes to get through
Mhm.
them. But do what we can.
Yeah. So you mentioned social media, and I'm wondering, do you ever feel compelled to speak out on a certain issue or certain crisis? I know you have a personal Twitter. I haven't seen the Twitter for the journal specifically. I don't know. But anyway, as a journal or personally, do you ever feel like you need to take a stand one way or the other, or sort of tell people about the truth about a specific crisis, or do you actually try to kind of steer clear of doing that altogether?
Absolutely steer clear of,
Yeah.
of doing that altogether. There's controversy typically grabs a lot of attention.
Mhm.
I'm not sure it's the right kind of attention though.
Yeah.
For not for something like we're doing. And us as an organization, our mission is to promote these writers and
Mhm.
artists. And the way we do that is by giving them the floor.
Mhm.
So for us to use that as a soapbox would be really a disservice to our mission and a disservice to the writers we've published.
That
And
makes
I
sense,
mean,
yeah. Because I
yeah,
imagine the writers themselves have so many varied views, so you don't want to necessarily align yourself with one particular position if it might contradict like a writer's position.
sure. Yeah, and it's really as simple as that,
Yeah.
as just giving them the floor. And
Mhm.
the other part of that too is that something vets understand, something that military family members or even the neighbors of vets understand is the veteran population and the population that's involved in some way with the military is incredibly diverse.
Mhm.
Of any subset of the population of the United States, I mean, you get people from every walk of life.
Yeah.
They go on to lead lives that are just as different as any random sampling of American citizens.
Mhm.
So part of the way we demonstrate that is we publish these volumes of work that have such diverse
Yeah.
voices in them and have such different lives being led by folks. So
Mhm.
um weighing in on something that's very topical, I think would kind of detract from that. Yeah.
Sure, sure. Can you take us through the editorial process of a piece that was heavily edited by one of your editors? So it came in, what did it have that excited you about it? And what were some of the flaws? And then how did you take it from its initial submission to its publishable state?
Gotcha. I have a really good example for this actually. Um, got a piece a while back, and it was written by a guy who'd served 20 years. He's a senior non-commissioned officer, and initially reading the piece, it struck me that there's really powerful emotion in there. It was a fiction story. It was about a veteran's transition into the civilian world. Um,
Hmm.
there was a lot of really raw emotion in there. There was certainly there was a lot of anger, to be forthright about it. And there was a guy that wanted to learn more about the craft. And the piece, as it was written, I thought it had some craft problems. It had ciphers for characters. It had one character that didn't have any nuance to them whatsoever. It was a very it was kind of like a tunnel vision. This is what this character is, and this is everything else is predictable from here on out. So um I worked with him, and I had several phone conversations with him in which um I asked him, okay, what do you want readers to take away from reading your story? And he gave me a very detailed explanation of the the essence of what he wanted a reader to walk away with, right? So I took that, I thought about it for a few days. I read the piece several more times. I thought, okay, how can we make this story illustrate what he wants to illustrate? So we brainstormed several different things, and we also looked at some things like just real basic craft stuff like dialogue.
Hmm.
Some dialogue was a bit wooden, and sometimes dialogue is like written English. Nobody really speaks that way. So
Yeah.
we have to, use some contraction stuff like that, the real basic stuff. But also there were things like, okay, what about this character's family? What kind of influence does his wife have? What kind of things do his children make him think of when he's faced with this situation? And it was working with like an employment office or something like that. We went through a bunch of drafts. Sorry, neighbor's dog. We went through a bunch of drafts, and as we went, the revision suggestions got more and more refined. We started with this really big order stuff, like, okay, this scene might not work. Let's swap it out or get rid of it altogether or whatever. And it's a really dynamic process. A lot of times we'll make suggestions and a writer will use that and think about it for a while and come back with something completely different that works far better than the suggestion we had to begin with. So it's like okay, so we sort of edit a new piece with every revision. But we went on for, let's say, 8 or 9 drafts.
Wow.
And he really did the work. And anytime you make a suggestion that someone, some element of the craft that someone might not be immediately familiar with, try to give them a short story of like, it's exemplary for that particular concept we're trying to illustrate.
Mhm.
So like for dialogue, Flannery O'Connor is really great to illustrate like, hey, this is how people talk. Or Raymond Carver with a kind of really sparse acting and dialogue and stuff like that. But at the end of the process, he had a story that was pretty good. Like, hey man, congrats. You're going to be in the next issue.
Oh, that's great.
Really every editorial interaction is quite different. It really depends on the individual, and it depends too on what knowledge they're coming to your inbox with. If someone doesn't know who Flannery O'Connor was, doesn't know who Hemingway is, something like that, it's going to be a much more, you're gonna go heavy on the basics at first and see where you can go from there.
Have you encountered writers that are resistant to doing the revision?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I would when I first started writing, I was definitely one of those folks. It's part of it is certainly, that's one of the first conversations we'll have with new writers, actually. And it's part of what makes our organization what it is we'll take the time to have this conversation. Okay, this is, and the nonfiction editors have a much tougher time with this, I'm sure. I rarely edit nonfiction, so it's understood that we're working on an impersonal piece of craft when it's fiction. When it's nonfiction, it's like, this is this person's story.
Yeah.
So how do you critique the presentation of that story while also making them understand that this is not critiquing the experience itself?
Right.
But yeah, it's very nuanced. But certainly have had writers that don't necessarily agree with your suggestions and whatnot. And typically that's a situation where it's like, I can think about it in a nuanced way and think, well, okay, if you have a better idea, we'll see it. I'm not so assured of my own expertise that I think inside of a box. And a lot of times writers really surprise me with the things that they think of.
Right.
So
I imagine you must confront attention a lot between what actually happened and then sort of elevating that into a narrative that resonates with people. That there must be a lot of writers who get resistant because they feel like, but this is what happened. I was there, this is what happened. Without fully maybe understanding yet that needs, in order to be successful, it needs to work at a craft level as well.
Yeah, and I think the other side of that, the way we make that work is just by having some empathy. Most of the people that are editing for us, they've either served in the military or they have a family member that has, or they're aware enough to know that these are things with which you have to have empathy to discuss.
Right.
And again, it goes back to that conversation, like, hey, we're going to help you make this a really good piece of writing rather than just like a narrative of an experience. Like, and the other way we demonstrate that is we'll point to really powerful works, like read that and see how that makes you feel, and like do that with fiction a lot. James Jones has a couple of short stories, for instance. He's got one in particular called The Knife. I think that's the title of it. But it's about a veteran confronting a civilian that was sort of ignorant about what World War II was like. And James Jones served in the Pacific, so it was pretty nasty stuff. But the way he wrote that story, it was that anger and annoyance was very understated, and it was artistic the way it was presented. So pointing them to works that worked is a pretty good way to have that conversation too.
Sure. And you mentioned the healing sort of process that happens. You said you think about that a lot at the magazine. I'm wondering if you've sort of seen that firsthand as you work with writers, because revision is, obviously its own frustrating process, so sometimes it might not feel like you're healing when you have to revise your story 9 times, but are you seeing that when you work with writers, that there is some sort of talking through the experience and figuring out a way to kind of transform it into something different?
Sometimes, but I certainly always hedge on wanting to think that we're instrumental in that process. That stuff's happening in therapy. It's happening with one of the ways that is absolutely tangible for everyone involved. A great example, we have a Vietnam veteran. He had never discussed his experience in Vietnam with anyone, certainly with his family. His children were grown, and he came to us with I think it was a poem. It's been years, but he worked with us, created this wonderful poem. Yes, it was a poem. It's about going to the Vietnam Wall. And after we published it, he emailed us a while after that, and he said, I'd never spoken to my family about this, and this really served as the conversation that I couldn't have with them.
Wow.
This was the conversation. So that's absolutely tangible. And that's
wow.
it's there's sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely heavy as hell. Stuff like that. Stuff like I worked with a Korean War veteran who did not do email. So said, well, mail me your stuff. And he would mail me handwritten stories. And I'd talk to him on the phone about revising it, type up like kind of revision guidelines and this stuff. But he was talking about really intense combat in the in the Korean War, and he never talked about this stuff before. And just having conversations with me, told me how he didn't deal with it for a really long time, and now at the end of his life, he was like, I got to get this stuff out. I can't take it with me to the other side.
Wow.
And he was the same way. He was like, yeah, I was able to show that to my sons. Like, yeah, that's why I was kind of angry sometimes when it snowed or something like that. So there's a lot of that that's happened. I don't think I'd really be qualified to say whether those things are healing or not, because it sometimes they're unearthing stuff they're not really sure what to do with. And I'm certainly no clinician, so.
Right. So are a lot of the writers you encounter, are they writing, in secret all of this time, or do you find that they find your magazine and that sort of compels them to try and write something? Do you have a sense of, like, if it's just seeing your call for submissions, that it's inspiring them to write a poem and talk about something they've never talked about, or have they been sort of writing poetry for many, many years and just never shown it to anyone?
You know, that's tough to answer. Because we normally don't ask,
Yeah.
It's something very, very personal to them. And
Right.
gosh, I think sometimes we've definitely run into something where it's like, I would never tell someone I wrote poetry, but here you guys are, and we'll use a pseudonym or something like that. But there's also a lot of, I've always wanted to do this, and now I have the time to do it, and it's really cool you guys exist, so I can try this out. And there's a lot of there are a lot of like organic writing workshops in the veteran community, and in a tangible sense, like a vet center, for instance, will have a writing workshop, and they'll encourage these folks, like, submit your work somewhere after this is over and you've got a decent piece. I've had conversations with a few people who have facilitated those types of workshops, and kind of show them the ropes, like, yeah, here's a list of military themed publishers like Consequence and Wrath Bearing Tree and several others. And we're just one of a few there, but yeah, how they arrive at the inspiration to do that, it's there are probably as many answers for that as there are submissions in the hopper.
Sure. Do you keep in touch with your contributors over the long haul? It seems like your magazine is offering, it's more than just publication, it's like a real community that you're building, and a kind of special, rare, maybe hard to find community. So is there kind of ongoing contact with contributors?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And a lot of that's really, I mean, it's not any kind of a formal thing or anything like that, but yeah, I mean, make friends with some of these writers, absolutely. And writers will come back to you after, say, they got a book published, like, hey, I know you guys published me a long time ago, check this out, I just got this book deal, stuff like that. And then there's also, I follow a lot of different military themed publications, and I'll see names of folks that we've worked with and folks that I've talked to and stuff like that. It's so yeah, like I said, it's a fairly small community, a small corner of the literary sphere. So there's definitely some familiarity sort of built in there.
Sure. What are some other war-themed magazines? So I know Consequence Journal, and I know of Oh Dark 30. Are they still around?
Yep.
Okay.
They're still around.
And you guys, and then I think that's the extent of my.
So there's also the Wrath Bearing Tree.
Okay.
There's the Line Literary Review, which is operated out of Columbia University. There is gosh, I see this list so often, and I'm trying to pull it out of the imagery in my brain.
That's okay. We can come back to it later. But
yeah.
do you collaborate with them in any way?
Yeah, actually, over the winter, Raspberry Tree, Collateral Journal, which is another one, Consequence, and O Dark 30, we're all going to put together a panel of editors, kind of an ask an editor or anything. Some scheduling conflicts and a couple other things. It's like herding cats with us, you know.
Yeah.
but certainly we promote each other's work, and we really we point writers to different military themed publishers too. And so it's sort of a way we collaborate. But and certainly the editors will talk with each other, just kind of editors all face the same problems everywhere, so we'll some insider jokes, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. And for those who are watching this and are thinking about submitting, is there anything that you just will not accept? Are there any conditions where you will not work with a writer? Is there anything you like absolutely do not want to see?
Yeah. So in the past, we've had like really recently, actually, we've had pieces that are just like outright cultural condemnations of groups or religions and stuff like that, and like, nah, we're definitely not going to work with that.
Right.
We'll give everything a first look, and it's really a matter of like, is this appropriate? There's stuff like outright anger and condemnation at society that's just not stuff that's not constructive.
Yeah.
We absolutely just like don't have the time for, you know.
Can I ask a quick question? Are your rejection letters different than other, like, so you get something like that, it's just a rant, it's some, you know, like over the top, and you're just gonna reject it. Do you also point the writer toward, I imagine rejection letters for your magazine would have to be such a delicate thing. So do you point the writer toward resources, or does that maybe come across as condescending, or what, how do you handle that?
Oh, case by case. For instance, say we get a piece of historical fiction. I'm a absolute history nerd and know far too many details about historical military stuff, right? And say this writer doesn't want to work with an editor, but their historical fiction is like rife with all kinds of errors in the details. Like the Army's Criminal Investigation Department wasn't created till the 1970s, but there's a World War II story involving the Army's Criminal Investigation Department, something like that, right? If they don't want to work with an editor, I'll say like, okay, so here's what's up with this story. Here's why, you know, if you're going to do historical fiction, it's one of the absolute hardest, because there's so many details that you have to get right that you don't give a second thought to. It's something that's written in a contemporary context. But yeah, sometimes though it's a matter of, hey man, this isn't really appropriate, and there's no way we could work with this. I've gotten some really wild stuff that's just like written for shock value, kind of.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'll absolutely take the time to discuss like, hey, this is not, like, you can't send stuff like this to journals.
Yeah.
It's just not, I mean, I've got examples, but that's a whole other.
Well, you don't have to give an example of
We don't need to
what
go
they
there.
sent necessarily, but would you, it sounds like in certain instances, you'll give very specific feedback. It won't just be a form rejection. It will also be
Oh,
like,
sure.
we, like, just so you know, this, you know, this isn't going to work in the world.
Oh, sure. And I mean, sometimes it's, hey, we've got this many editors this time. Like, this is a good piece. We
Mhm.
just don't have the capacity to take it on.
Mhm.
So yeah, I really do try to be personal when it comes to rejections. And
Right.
because there's, I mean, form rejections, they certainly have their place, and they're a part of the process, but
Mhm.
it's also a matter of letting someone know, like, hey, yeah, your work was definitely read and it's pretty good.
Mhm.
We just can't take it right now. And something sometimes can be as simple as just pulling an example out of a hat. We have too many basic training related stories for that volume,
Mhm.
so we have to pick among those something that we think will work best, and the others have to wait till next time. But yeah, it's always pretty tricky, and it's the worst part of being an editor.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you're saying that's the stuff you don't really want to see. Are there particular things you do want to see more of? Maybe regions of the world you want to see more of, or particular kinds of experiences you want to hear more about?
You know, as far as like a targeted, this is what we want to see. We really always enjoy being surprised.
Mhm.
There are stories that come through. Uh, shoot, like to ask for something specifically, almost excludes so much that we don't even know about and can't conceptualize yet.
Right.
You know.
Right.
Um, but I would say anything that has a nuanced look at a very nuanced segment of society
Mhm.
and different impacts. Like I've always felt some of the most powerful stories were from folks writing about their parents, right? Um, we had a lady, for instance, whose parents had survived the Holocaust. She was Italian American, and writing about her father's very particular ways in which he led his life after that, especially in terms of stuff like food waste,
Mhm.
how it was like strictly forbidden. Like
Mhm.
stuff like that is just, it's fascinating. And
Yeah.
it also illustrates that something like the existence of militaries in our society has such a broad impact. It touches everything.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, it impacts a kindergarten class as much as it impacts the veteran that served in it,
Yeah.
if that makes any sense.
Sure. And so just a point of clarification, it's not, you're not only seeking submissions from people who've actively served, from veterans, you're also seeking submissions
Right.
from people who've been affected in some way, children,
Hmm.
grandchildren, friends.
Oh, sure. And I mean, friends, neighbors,
Mhm.
there are a multitude of different impacts that military service has, and the broader scope we can show our reading audience, the broader we can make that look.
Mhm.
I mean, that's that is also absolutely fulfilling our mission. Yeah.
And for the fiction submissions, are you open to a submission just from somebody who's writing about who, you know, researched the topic and is really interested in a particular conflict but doesn't have personal experience in it?
That's another really tricky one.
Yeah.
Um, some of that stuff's very hard to pull off.
Yeah.
Right? It's very hard to pull off, especially when you've got a lot of veterans that are editors. there's And this is not saying, anybody can write about anything. Anybody
Mhm.
can write about anything very well. The degree of difficulty that's going to have varies between folks' levels of experience and their levels of research, right? If it's good work, sure, take a look at it. And I know we've published stuff that's written by folks who didn't serve. That, I mean, it's good work. There's universal truths in that work that a veteran would say, and it's not for us to say, well, since you didn't serve, you can't write about that experience. It's more of a, how does your viewpoint influence what that story looks like? And sometimes it's very different from someone with firsthand experience about it.
Yeah. Yeah. So are there ways to volunteer with the magazine, either as a reader or volunteer editor? How can people get more involved?
Oh, we've got a contact form on our website. Anybody's welcome to reach out and see what they can do for us. So we always appreciate the help, definitely.
Oh, great.
We normally actually get a lot of the folks that end up editing for us will have worked with our editors before, or have a piece published with us or something like that. They stick around like, hey, this is pretty cool, I'll help out. And that's always it's always been a big source of volunteers.
Yeah. And so your volunteer readers or editors, should they have had some kind of personal military related experience, or can they just be wanting to be part of it?
No, not necessarily. And as a matter of fact, sometimes sometimes it's good that they don't, because one of our main editorial goals is, let's put these experiences into universal language. Let's make this approachable to everyone. Let's translate some of this stuff, like nomenclature for military equipment, for example. Maybe no one knows what an M1A1 Abrams is, but everybody knows what a tank is.
Yeah.
Presumably. Someone with a civilian background can help a vet kind of translate that stuff into language that's digestible by the broader reading public. So no, absolutely anyone's welcome to come on board.
That's great. And so what is on the horizon for you guys? I know you have an issue coming out in May, end of May.
Yep. Every Memorial Day, every Veterans Day, we run a publication. So our editors are very busy folks in their own spheres of, in their own lives too. We've certainly talked about a kind of the word escapes me at the moment. Oh gosh, an anthology. Kind of a best of stuff. This year we're definitely going to start with award nominations for push cards, stuff like that. And we're absolutely just going to continue on with what we're doing, because it's proven to be a pretty valuable thing to the folks, to our readers and to the writers. And probably some more collaboration with other organizations and publications in the community here.
Great. So people can find you on your, oh, I see we have somebody tuning in right as we're wrapping things up, but that's okay. So people can find you on your website and also on Twitter. You have your own Twitter handle. Do you know, this is a question, this is like the moment where I become a gotcha journalist, because editors never know the Twitter handle for their own magazines. So my question to you is, do you know the Twitter handle for your journal?
At Mill Experience, MIL Experience. Yes, I do.
Good.
Absolutely.
All right. At Military Experience. Is that right?
at Mill Experience,
At
just
Mill
for my
Experience.
all.
Okay, at Mill
Yep.
Experience. Awesome. Thank you. So everybody should check you out. Go to your website, read the journal. It's all online, so people can read the stories, the poetry, nonfiction. There's also a lot of art, which we didn't talk about, but it's pretty intense stuff to look at.
It's
So,
very intense
yeah,
stuff. A lot of it's, yeah, very intense.
yeah, but it's
Not,
great.
not graphic, but it certainly evokes some emotion, some of it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's an amazing project that you're doing. So best of luck with it and keep going and keep us in the loop.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.